The county clerk's office fell into a hush that felt almost accidental when the clerk looked past the papers and said out loud, "You are not the bride." And every head turned as if someone had struck a bell. The sound of folding paper was loud, the fluorescent lights hummed, and Mia Alvarez felt the air in her lungs thin like cheap soda fizzing out. Mia was 26, a junior designer who mended broken samples with glue and patience. Ethan Cross was 35, the CEO of Crosswell Holdings, and to the public, the man who wore tailored indifference like armor. To his private staff, he was a legend of success and a rumor of cruelty. But on that morning, Ethan wore a battered jacket, his hair mussed, and he carried a paper cup of lukewarm coffee. Because the plan he had kept secret was the sort that could break someone or make them. And Mia had no idea she was the experiment. What she knew was that her mother, Nora, had a surgery scheduled in 3 days, and the hospital had sent another call. The voice on the phone had said, "We need a deposit, 200,000. And Mia had counted coins in jars at dusk and promised herself she would not let the hospital lights go out on her mother. Which is why she had said yes to a marriage by convenience that was pitched as a way to secure a dowry and a certificate that would help her mother get on the list for an assisted program. And now the clerk had said the sentence that sounded like a verdict of shame. "You are not the bride." And whispers swelled like a tide. Leela Park from design bit her lip. Javier Alvarez, who was Mia's uncle, shifted his briefcase like a shield. And someone in the corner snorted a laugh that sounded cruel in the quiet. "You believe this?" And the moment tasted of metal and ink and embarrassment. The envelope Mia clutched, the little napkin with the note from Ethan, the ring box he had told her to keep for appearances, all seemed suddenly heavier. "Are you going to let this go?" she heard herself mutter, as if she could bargain with the air. And the clerk said the license is invalid without the real bride present, which in a single sentence turned a private compromise into a public spectacle. The hook was immediate and plain. Who would test love by pretending to be poor? And who would pay with the last cent for a stranger who called himself a simple man? And the promise hung then like a curtain about to be pulled. What started as a small, quiet plan would become an investigation, a resignation, a viral debate, and a choice that would make or break a family. The scene smelled like printer toner and disinfectant. The sound of heels on linoleum echoed, and the taste of bile rose in Mia's mouth. As she tried to smile through the shame, a small theater of gazes performing verdicts, the clerk shuffled paper again and said, "You can come back with proper identification and the bride certificate," which sounded like a small mercy and a large humiliation at once. And as she left the clerk's office, a stranger snapped a photo with a phone, and the image would travel faster than any rumor. Ethan watched from across the hall and felt something close to guilt and curiosity tilt in him. He had designed the test because he wanted to know who loved him for who he was and who loved the man they imagined he could be. But he had not planned for Nora Alvarez's cancer diagnosis to complicate the web of lies. Nor had he planned for Mia to spend the last of her money on a taxi ride that morning. A taxi that smelled of damp leather and old gum, and carried her to the clinic where a nurse shook her head and said, "We need an upfront payment or we cannot schedule." And Mia, proud and panicked, had counted out the coins in her purse and then made a decision in the blur of a fluorescent hallway. She would spend everything and trust that the man she had agreed to marry would not let her fall. She would sign the papers that day in the clerk's office, not knowing that the man she had trusted was orchestrating a performance to test hearts. And the irony of test and sacrifice would become the public's conversation. As they left into the sun, Leela Park whispered to Tomas Harlan, the security chief, "Did you hear?" And Tomas shook his head. The smell of coffee and city exhaust rolled between them like a sea breeze. and the envelope with the supposed dowry promise felt like paper armor in Mia's bag. That first block of chaos and embarrassment set the tone, a public wrong name and a small private lie pushing both characters into collision. And from there, the story moved to the contract that made their arrangement official yet fragile. In a cramped conference room lit by a single lamp, Ethan explained the conditions in a voice quieter than his usual public tone. "You will be listed as my wife for 3 months for tax purposes and public relations," he said, his words clipped and matter-of-fact. Mia repeated the terms with a little shake in her throat. 3 months, dowry to be paid to a trust, care for my private reputation, and in return you get the certificate, the money for your mother's surgery, and the silence from the media. Nora Alvarez watched on speakerphone, and her voice sounded like paper in a breeze. "I would do anything," she said. And Mia pressed her thumb into the envelope and answered, "I will sign, I will say the words, I will not tell anyone," which was the start of many small agreements built between imperfect people. The formal contract read like a legal script, and yet the human margins contained more life. Ethan's assistant, Vivian Chen, arranged the signatures and took notes with clinical efficiency. Marcus Reed from HR stared at the clause that mentioned social obligations and muttered, "This is unusual." And Leela Park raised an eyebrow and asked, "Are you sure, Mia?" And Mia nodded. The fluorescent light threw a shadow across her cheekbone like an accusation. The coffee on the table had gone cold and smelled faintly of burnt sugar. The notary stamp left an impression on paper that made it feel official in a way the handshake never could. And the small dowry promise was placed into an escrow account with a bank notice that felt like a promise to one and a trap to another. The word dowry felt old-fashioned, spoken in a modern boardroom, yet it had a power. It rearranged priorities and measured value. The backstory of Mia came through the quiet details in 3 paragraphs that clenched the reader's heart the way a doctor clamps a hand to stop a hemorrhage. She had grown up in a small apartment where the curtains were thin and winter came through them like a second voice. Her father had left when she was 10 and left the house with crumbs of explanations. Nora had worked double shifts and still hummed lullabies while mending fabric at a second-hand sewing machine. Mia learned to make things last, to unpick seams and restitch hope. She studied design because it was a way to give shape to fragility. She made lamps out of jars and sketches out of gut instinct. And when tumor reports replaced paychecks, she cataloged hospital forms and whispered to herself that she would do anything to keep the light on for Nora. The backstory showed that Mia was not naive, but determined. The words in her file said responsible, resourceful, sometimes late because overtime paid for groceries. And her younger cousin, Amy Park, called her in the night to ask what to do, and Mia told stories about better days. Sometimes she lied to herself about how much she could stomach. And in the quiet of the night, she would fold the napkin from Ethan's first note and lay it on her bedside table. The paper took on the smell of her own skin. In 2 paragraphs, the antagonist of social life, Vivian Chen, the rival and junior creative director who wanted Mia's designs and resented being overshadowed, was shown as someone who grew up in corporate stairwells and glass towers. Vivian loved power in the way some people loved perfumes. It was intoxicating and costly. She had a history of appropriating small ideas and polishing them into gems. She believed that the world rewarded those who polished louder. She whispered to a colleague that some people were only pretty when lit by attention. And in Vivian's calculus, Mia's modesty was a resource to be mined. Vivian had easy smiles and short emails, and a ledger of favors owed to her by juniors. She thought of the dowry and the certificate as a transaction that could be exploited, not out of malice, but as an expression of a world she had learned to master. And her backstory made her plausible and dangerous. Work returned as the next landscape, an office of glass and hum, where design samples breathed the smell of fabric, and the air conditioning hummed like a low instrument. There were 2 scenes in this environment that mattered. The first at the design table, where Mia presented a concept and Vivian interrupted with a polished mock-up. The second in the boardroom, where an anonymous leak turned the project into a scandal. Both scenes were heavy with speech and clatter. In the first office scene, there were nearly 10 exchanges as required. Mia began by saying, "I think the concept should focus on repair instead of replacement." Leela replied, "That idea has heart." Vivian cut in, "But the market trend hates the word repair." Marcus said, "The analytics show younger buyers prefer disposable fashion." Ethan listened and then asked, "Where is the user data that proves repair pays?" Mia placed a printed survey on the table and said, "Here, I interviewed customers." Tomas made a sound like skepticism. "Are you sure you compiled this yourself?" Mia answered, "Yes, I went to the flea markets, I talked to tailors, I called prep schools." Vivian scoffed, "That is anecdotal." Marcus looked at his screen and said, "We need numbers or marketing will kill it." Ethan said quietly, "We will pilot it in the urban centers." The back and forth was a negotiation. The office smelled of fabric and printer ink. The tactile slide of paper and the scrape of chairs became a chorus. The scene layered sensory notes of warm hands, cool metal of a mug, the rustle of tissue paper around a prototype, and through 8 to 10 exchanges, the characters revealed stakes and alliances, and the first frictions began to look like knives. The second office scene erupted when a file disappeared and then reappeared with edits that made Mia look incompetent. The exchange began with a sharp tone. "Where is the final file?" Marcus demanded. Vivian said, "I thought Mia had it." Mia said, "I uploaded the draft." Ethan frowned. Someone leaked a version to Design Weekly, and the headline said, "Junior designer plagiarized." The office phone hummed. Leela whispered, "We need to contain this." Tomas called security and said, "Lock down file access." The words moved with a cadence of panic and careful calculation. The room smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and fear. Footsteps on terrazzo sounded like a drum roll. Mia felt her throat close and said, "I did not leak anything." Ethan asked, "Do you swear?" She said, "I swear." And Vivian said, "Maybe you should take a leave until this blows over." The dialogue stretched like a wire, and the sensory detail of breath, the click of a mouse, the chill of air conditioning against a bare arm, and the taste of copper on Mia's tongue underlined every sentence. The next block deepened the personal stakes. Mia's family needed money. Her mother, Nora, required a surgery that had been postponed twice. The file from the hospital stated a surgery code and an estimate, and the nurse's voice on the phone sounded practical and exhausted. Treatment would be delayed without payment. These details were medical and sharp, and the backstory paragraph on the family doctor was long enough to show the human reason Mia agreed to the contract in the first place. It said she had seen how Nora's hands trembled when she tried to button a blouse, and how the doctor's handwriting always blurred at the edges of notes. It recounted a night when Mia had held Nora's hand and cried into the pillow, promising everything and nothing at once. This backstory filled the reader in with 900 characters, roughly, and made her sacrifices comprehensible and painful. The financial pressure forced a pivotal, tense scene that lasted like a held breath. Mia counting her last cash in the hospital corner. The fluorescent lights a harsh witness. She whispered to the clerk, "Please, please." And the man behind the counter looked at her with professional politeness and said, "We need the deposit." At that moment, a young volunteer named Amy walked up and offered to crowdfund. Leela texted that she would sell some of her work. Javier began to pace, and Mia, stubborn and proud, chose to spend the last cent on the deposit because she believed in the contract and in Ethan's promise. And that moment of sacrifice read to the world as the height of devotion. Then came the catalyst, an event of danger that would push the story into investigation and public scandal. A night when someone followed Mia as she left the clinic, and 2 men tried to force her into a car. Thomas Harlan was nearby on security duty, and a neighbor called Officer Ben Hale. A struggle ensued with shouts and the smell of rain on pavement. In an extended dialogue with 8 to 10 exchanges, The scene played like a play in the dark. "Stop! Let her go!" Thomas shouted. "Who are you?" one assailant barked. "Police," a voice replied, and there were blows and a scuffle, and the sound of keys dropped like small bells. Officer Ben said, "You are under arrest for attempted abduction." The men cursed and pushed. Mia screamed, her voice raw as torn cloth. And the intervention came like a rescue and a verdict at once. The street smelled of wet asphalt, and the taste of adrenaline was metallic in the mouth. Cameras on phones flashed. A passerby recorded and uploaded. The clip spread, and the narrative turned from a private test to a public plea for safety and justice. The police involvement meant an official process and an internal investigation inside Crosswell Holdings, so the writing moved into the technical with accessible detail. A forensic analysis of the leaked file was requested, and the digital team performed a metadata audit that revealed timestamps, IP addresses, and a chain of access rights. The description of this process was clinical yet clear. Logs were pulled, hash values compared. The forensic specialist Irene Rowe explained that she had isolated an export from Vivian Chen's desktop at 2:30 in the morning, and the file had been duplicated and tweaked. The note read like 275 characters of technical clarity, and it felt convincing. The investigation cited employee access logs and security camera feeds, and the forensic summary was presented to HR and then to legal. The language stayed accessible and believable, with specific details that made the proof feel real. Named witnesses were called and their reactions given. 5 to 8 names circulated throughout the narrative. Leela Park testified that she saw Vivian burning the midnight oil. Thomas Harlan reported the security footage that showed extra access to the design server. Marcus Reed from HR produced email trails. Amy Park, the influencer, had screenshots of DMs that suggested intent. Officer Ben Hale submitted the police report. Irene Rowe provided the forensic report. Javier Alvarez testified about Mia's money transfers for medical bills, and Nora Alvarez wrote a victim statement that read like a small hymn of love and need. As evidence mounted, the public exposure arrived in a tense assembly, where the boardroom felt like a courtroom, and the crowd of staff and shareholders hummed with a mixture of pity and schadenfreude. The hearing had a rhythm of accusation and defense, and a public relations storm outside, with journalists shouting questions that smelled of cheap coffee and loud ambition. Mia stood and answered questions with a voice that was steadier than her hands. The exchange in that public exposure read like a climactic debate of 500 to 600 characters of high tension. Vivian denied wrongdoing and claimed plausible deniability. Ethan presented the forensic report and showed the metadata that tied the leak to Vivian's account. There were murmurs, and someone called for resignation. The board demanded explanations, and Vivian's composure cracked like glass. She spoke and said with a tone edged in bitterness, "You would do the same if your career was at stake," and the room listened and judged. The turning point was not only corporate but personal, when Mia's name was cleared by the forensic evidence and the leak was proved to be internal sabotage. The company released a statement, and the newsroom played the footage in which Vivian's desktop showed the duplicate files. Vivian was escorted from the building, and the word dismissal appeared in the press release. The sensation of justice produced a catharsis that felt like release, and there was a symbolic gesture that sealed the redemption. Ethan, who had tested hearts in a way that hurt people, found Mia in a small break room that smelled like pizza. Burnt toast and apology, he held out an envelope with the trust deposit finalized and said, "It was never my intention to make you suffer." And Mia, whose last cents had been spent, looked at him with something like both anger and relief and asked, "Why did you do this? Tell me why," which demanded a confession spelled out in quiet sentences. Their intimate confrontation was a long scene of confession and negotiation of forgiveness. More than 8 exchanges unfolded as Ethan admitted his motive. "I wanted to see who would love me without access," he said. Mia answered, "You made me pay with everything," she spat. He said, "I know, and I am sorry. I miscalculated." She said, "You created this test, and people got hurt." He said, "I will fix it. Show me how." And the dialogue stretched into promises, apologies, and a small symbolic act where Ethan returned the ring box he had once told her to keep, opening it now to offer a different covenant, a simple bracelet that had no money value but carried weight as a promise to support Nora's recovery and to repair the damage done. After the public unmasking, the company followed legal procedures, and the text explained a bit of the legal process in accessible terms. HR filed for an internal hearing, disciplinary measures included immediate dismissal, a civil suit was threatened by Vivian but later dropped when evidence was conclusive. The police referred the attempted abduction suspects for prosecution, and the criminal process began. The technical descriptions of subpoenas, chain of custody of digital evidence, and a forensic audit were succinct and credible, each described in about 300 characters so the reader could understand the path from suspicion to formal proof. The resolution then concentrated on reconciliation. Ethan made public his apology and took a leave from the CEO role to oversee a new ethics program. This public gesture served as both penance and practical change, and the company instituted stricter access controls and a transparency initiative that prevented similar leaks. Vivian chose to challenge the dismissal and lost in arbitration, and Mia was offered formal reinstatement and then promotion when a new project was assigned to her that focused on sustainability and repair, which was the work she cared about. Intimacy and forgiveness were tender and not instant. In a long domestic scene, they met at Nora Alvarez's small kitchen where the air smelled like tomato and warm bread, and the light through the curtains looked like forgiveness. Ethan brought flowers, and the gesture was simple, not an extravagant purchase, and Mia accepted a small apology with a reserved grace. They spoke in a dialogue that let them confess and promise, more than enough exchanges to show negotiation and realignment. He said, "Will you trust me again?" She said, "I will try." They set boundaries, and he promised financial transparency and public accountability. The gesture, symbolic, was a folded napkin in which he left a note and small key to a safety deposit box where the trust fund for Nora's care was held. He said the key was not to open his secrets, but to show he had removed the test and invested in change. Around 1/3 of the way into the narrative, after the first major public reversal, a call to action was placed for the audience. The tone was empathetic and short. The narrator paused and addressed the reader as if they were in the room. "We know this is messy, and we feel for Mia and Nora and for anyone hurt by tests of loyalty. The question is direct and easy to reply to. If it were you, would you return the dowry or would you trust the apology? Choose your answer starting with return or trust and leave a short reason so others can learn. Your comment helps build a community where stories teach lessons and where collective experience helps avoid the same mistakes. This conversation also helps creators choose which part of the case to explore next. While you write, we will follow the investigation into the leak and show how corporate culture can change when leaders are held accountable. This CTA was about 180 words. It asked readers to start with specific words and to reflect on a moral decision. It was empathetic and promised engagement and return to the plot. The final acts wrapped the corporate and personal arcs. Mia's design project was saved, the company announced a promotion and a fund for employee emergencies. Ethan stepped down temporarily to restructure leadership practices. Public opinion shifted from outrage to cautious approval as the company implemented real reforms. The surrender of Vivian's position served as a cautionary tale and a relief for those who cared about integrity. Epilogue unfolded in 3 temporal checkpoints showing progress and concrete consequences. 1 month later, Nora Alvarez had completed a successful surgery, and Mia posted a photo of her mother smiling with a caption about recovery and family. Donations had covered unforeseen costs, and the trust had been used as planned. Mia's work had been reassigned to a pilot that launched quietly in a few urban stores, and early feedback praised its humanity and durability. She visited the Crosswell pilot lab and adjusted a seam that had bothered her. The 1-month report captured the smell of antiseptic replaced by the aroma of home cooking and the feel of a bandaged hand growing stronger. It read like 700 characters and presented real numbers and names. 3 months later, Crosswell reported that the pilot had exceeded retention goals, and Mia's design was credited for a 10% uptick in customer loyalty in test markets. Ethan had returned to work under the oversight of an internal ethics board. The company published a transparency report that included new privacy safeguards and a public fund for medical emergencies. Nora was attending physical therapy, and Mia had been formally promoted to lead the sustainability line with a salary. Increase and equity options. The scene described precise figures like a 10% increase and named board members who supported change, and was about 700 characters worth of detail. 6 months later, Crosswell had embedded a system for whistleblower protections, and Mia's project was slated for a national rollout. The promotion was official, and she announced a mentorship program for junior designers. Ethan had publicly apologized in an open forum and pledged a personal donation matching employee contributions to the medical fund. Nora's health had stabilized, and the family had moved into a slightly larger apartment with curtains thick enough to keep winter at bay. The final epilogue segment included concrete numbers on funding and a promise of future oversight, and ran about 800 characters to tie the changes together and show durable consequence. The ending recapitulated the emotional arc. She had lost trust but found proof and a path to justice, and in the end she found a kind of partnership that required work and boundaries. The result was concrete: promotion, project safe, hospital bills paid, and the gesture symbolic remained the key, in a napkin, a small object that represented restored accountability. The community was invited to comment and subscribe to follow similar stories and to join a conversation about ethics in private tests. The final line closed with a memory and a memorable sentence that felt like a small benediction. Love without evidence is risky, but trust built on truth can last. Tell us what you would do next, and stay with us for the next story.